Between 1820 and 1924, tens of millions of Europeans walked away from villages their families had inhabited for generations. They sold small plots of land, livestock, furniture, tools, and nearly everything they could not carry. At ports in Liverpool, Hamburg, Bremen, Naples, and other coastal cities, entire families waited beside wooden trunks containing the remains of their former lives. Most did not know whether they would ever see their homeland again. They were not leaving because the United States offered certainty, but because remaining in Europe had become a future of hunger, unemployment, military service, religious persecution, and permanent poverty. Across the continent, population growth placed enormous pressure on land and food supplies, while industrialization destroyed traditional forms of work faster than factories could absorb the displaced population. In Ireland, famine emptied villages. In Germany and Central Europe, failed revolutions and political repression pushed thousands into exile. In Italy, Poland, Russia, and the territories of Eastern Europe, agricultural crises, ethnic discrimination, compulsory military service, and violent persecution convinced millions that survival required departure. Letters sent home by earlier migrants described higher wages, available land, and expanding American cities. Shipping companies and recruitment agents transformed these reports into a powerful promise. Beyond the Atlantic, an ordinary worker might finally control the direction of his own life. But America was not waiting with open arms. The ocean crossing was exhausting. Arrival inspections could separate families, and the immigrants who were admitted often entered a world of overcrowded tenements, dangerous factories, mines, railroad camps, prejudice, and exploitation. Yet their labor would help construct modern cities, expand industries, build railroads, organize workers, and permanently reshape the culture of the United States. This documentary follows that immense movement from Europe's impoverished countryside to Castle Garden and Ellis Island, revealing why millions abandoned everything they knew, how they survived in an unfamiliar country, and why the nation they helped transform eventually attempted to close its doors to them. 1. A Europe that could no longer offer them a future. At the beginning of the 19th century, most Europeans still lived in the countryside and depended directly on the land. Their survival was determined by the size of the harvest, the price of grain, and the decisions of landlords who controlled much of the cultivable territory. For families with no property, there was little protection against unemployment, illness, or a season of bad weather. When harvests failed, food became more expensive at the exact moment rural workers lost their income. For millions of peasants, remaining in their homeland meant living permanently one crisis away from hunger. Europe's population expanded rapidly during the 19th century. Improvements in agriculture, declining mortality, and the gradual control of certain diseases allowed more children to reach adulthood. But the amount of available land did not grow with them. Villages that had once supported a limited number of families now contained generations competing for the same fields, jobs, and resources. Population growth was celebrated as a sign of progress by governments, yet for the rural poor, it created a relentless struggle for survival. Land ownership was one of the central causes of this insecurity. In many regions, large estates belonged to aristocrats, wealthy families, or religious institutions, while the people who cultivated them remained tenants or seasonal laborers. These families paid rent for small plots that were often too limited to provide sufficient food. A landlord could raise the rent, divide the property, or remove a tenant with little concern for what would happen afterward. Working the land did not mean possessing it, and decades of labor rarely gave a peasant family any permanent claim to the soil. Inheritance practices made the problem even more severe. In some parts of Europe, farms were repeatedly divided among children, until each plot became too small to support a household. Elsewhere, the entire property passed to the eldest son, leaving younger siblings with no land at all. These landless sons and daughters had few choices: become servants, accept poorly paid agricultural work, join the military, move to a crowded city, or leave the country. Emigration began to appear not as an adventure, but as a practical answer to a future already closed to them. Industrialization promised to create a new Europe, but its first effects were often deeply disruptive. Machines increased production while reducing the need for traditional artisans, home-based textile workers, and many forms of manual labor. Weavers, shoemakers, metal workers, and other craftsmen discovered that factories could manufacture goods more quickly and cheaply than independent workshops. Skills passed through generations suddenly lost much of their economic value. The old rural economy was collapsing before the industrial system could provide secure employment for everyone it displaced. Those who migrated to industrial cities rarely found immediate prosperity. London, Manchester, Glasgow, Hamburg, Berlin, Vienna, and other expanding centers attracted enormous numbers of rural workers competing for the same positions. Employers could keep wages low because another desperate worker was always available. Families crowded into poorly constructed housing near factories, ports, and industrial districts, where sanitation was inadequate and disease spread easily. The city offered wages, but it also replaced rural insecurity with exhausting work, dangerous conditions, and the constant possibility of dismissal. Economic transformation also created long periods of instability. European industries depended increasingly on international markets, meaning that a commercial crisis in one country could close factories and eliminate jobs in another. Workers had few legal protections, compensation systems, or public services to support them during unemployment. A sudden fall in demand could leave an entire industrial district without income. For families already spending most of their wages on rent and food, even a temporary interruption could become a disaster. Conditions varied across the continent, but insecurity was widespread. Irish tenant farmers depended heavily on small plots and a limited food supply. German peasants and artisans faced population pressure and economic transformation. Southern Italians struggled with concentrated land ownership, agricultural poverty, and limited employment. Scandinavians endured isolated farms, harsh growing conditions, and a shortage of affordable land. In Eastern Europe, Polish, Jewish, Russian, and other communities confronted poverty combined with political, ethnic, or religious restrictions. They departed for different reasons, but they shared the belief that Europe had reserved its opportunities for someone else. Social position was difficult to change. The family into which a person was born often determined occupation, education, property, and political influence. Schooling remained inaccessible to many children, particularly when their labor was needed at home or in the fields. Without land, capital, or family connections, even a hardworking person could spend an entire lifetime without achieving economic independence. America's greatest attraction was therefore not simply the possibility of becoming rich, it was the possibility that effort might produce a different future for one's children. By the late 19th century, emigration had become part of everyday European life. Almost every affected village knew someone who had crossed the Atlantic and sent money or letters home. Departure no longer seemed unimaginable when neighbors and relatives had already established communities overseas. Europe was producing more workers than its land, and industries could securely employ, while the United States was demanding labor for its farms, railroads, mines, factories, and growing cities. Behind the millions who boarded ships stood a continent undergoing a profound transformation, one that generated wealth and technological progress, but left a vast portion of its population believing that their only future existed somewhere else. 2. Famine, war, and persecution forced millions to flee. Poverty alone did not explain the scale of European migration. For many families, departure came only after an extraordinary crisis destroyed the fragile balance that had allowed them to remain. A failed harvest, a political uprising, a military conflict, or a new campaign of persecution could transform hardship into an immediate threat. People who had endured difficult conditions for generations suddenly discovered that waiting was no longer possible. Emigration became a form of survival rather than a search for adventure. The most devastating example was the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845 when potato blight repeatedly destroyed the crop on which millions depended. Ireland continued producing other agricultural goods, but unequal land ownership, poverty, and an inadequate government response prevented food from reaching those who needed it most. Tenant families who could not pay rent were removed from their homes, while disease and malnutrition spread through impoverished communities. Over the following years, approximately 1 million people died, and more than 1 million fled the country, many of them traveling to the United States. The Irish Exodus demonstrated how a natural disaster could become a social and political catastrophe. The potato disease also affected other parts of Europe, but Ireland's dependence on a single crop and its system of land ownership made the consequences particularly severe. Families often sent one member across the Atlantic first, hoping that wages earned in America would finance the journeys of parents, siblings, or children. This chain migration gradually emptied rural districts and created large Irish communities in cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. The food crisis of the 1840s extended beyond Ireland. Poor grain harvests, rising prices, and unemployment produced unrest across much of Europe. In German-speaking territories, artisans and laborers faced both food shortages and the disruption caused by industrialization. In Scandinavia, repeated agricultural difficulties intensified the pressure on families with limited land. These crises revealed how little protection ordinary people possessed. A few failed seasons could erase savings, force the sale of property, and leave migration as the only remaining path. Political upheaval added another powerful reason to leave. In 1848, revolution spread through France, the German states, the Austrian Empire, Italy, Hungary, and other parts of Europe. Reformers demanded constitutions, national independence, freedom of the press, and greater political participation. Many uprisings were suppressed, and those who had supported them faced arrest, surveillance, professional exclusion, or exile. Thousands of political refugees, including many educated Germans later known as the 48ers, escaped to the United States. These refugees brought more than a desire for economic security. Many believed that the American political system offered freedoms denied by European monarchies. In the United States, some became journalists, teachers, lawyers, community leaders, and opponents of slavery. Their migration showed that the Atlantic movement was not composed only of impoverished peasants. It also included intellectuals, professionals, dissidents, and defeated revolutionaries who feared that remaining in Europe would cost them their liberty. War and compulsory military service drove away another portion of the population. During the 19th century, European states expanded their armies and required young men to serve for years, often interrupting work and separating them from their families. The wars surrounding Italian and German unification, conflicts within the Austrian and Russian empires, and repeated struggles over national borders created instability across the continent. Some immigrants left to avoid conscription, while others departed after warfare had damaged farms, trade, and local economies. Political repression was particularly severe in territories where national identity challenged imperial authority. Poles living under Russian, Prussian, or Austrian rule, experienced restrictions on political organization, language, and cultural institutions. Failed Polish uprisings in the 19th century were followed by arrests, confiscations, and increased government control. Hungarians, Czechs, Ukrainians, and other groups also confronted attempts to suppress political or national movements. For those considered disloyal by the ruling authorities, emigration offered a way to preserve both personal freedom and cultural identity. Religious and ethnic persecution became especially important during the Great Migration from Eastern Europe after 1880. Jewish communities in the Russian Empire faced discriminatory laws that restricted where they could live, study, work, and own property. Waves of organized violence and growing insecurity convinced entire families that gradual improvement was unlikely. Between the 1880s and the First World War, large numbers of Eastern European Jews traveled to the United States, settling primarily in urban neighborhoods where existing communities could provide housing, employment contacts, and mutual assistance. No single disaster caused the European exodus. Famine interacted with poverty, warfare destroyed already vulnerable economies, and persecution made ordinary life increasingly dangerous or restricted. The decision to leave usually emerged from several pressures acting at once: an empty harvest, an unaffordable rent, a military order, a failed rebellion, or a law that denied basic opportunities. For millions, the United States did not initially represent a perfect country. It represented distance from the forces that had made life in Europe impossible, and the possibility of beginning again beyond their reach. 3. How America became the promised land. America's reputation as a land of opportunity did not develop by accident. During the 19th century, stories about abundant land, higher wages, religious freedom, and social mobility circulated through European villages and industrial cities. To families trapped by poverty, rigid class divisions, or political repression, the United States appeared to offer something Europe could not: the possibility of beginning without being permanently defined by birth. The promise was often exaggerated, but it was powerful enough to persuade millions to cross an ocean with no guarantee of success. Land was one of the strongest attractions. In Europe, agricultural property was expensive, limited, and concentrated in the hands of aristocrats or wealthy landowners. In the United States, Western expansion created the impression that almost anyone could become an independent farmer. The Homestead Act of 1862 strengthened this image by allowing eligible settlers to claim federal land if they lived on and improved it. For a European tenant who had spent a lifetime cultivating another person's property, the possibility of owning a farm carried enormous emotional and economic significance. This land, however, was not truly empty. American expansion depended on the removal, confinement, and dispossession of indigenous nations that had occupied these territories for generations. Government advertisements and immigrant guidebooks rarely mentioned this reality. They presented the West as an open landscape, waiting to be cultivated, concealing the conflicts and policies that had made settlement possible. European immigrants were therefore invited into a national expansion whose human consequences they often did not fully understand. The expanding American economy created another powerful attraction: work. Railroads required enormous numbers of laborers to lay tracks, dig tunnels, and maintain new routes. Mines needed workers to extract coal, iron, copper, and other resources. Factories in cities such as New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit demanded a constant supply of labor. The work was frequently dangerous and poorly paid by American standards, but the wages could still appear substantial to Europeans accustomed to rural unemployment or extremely low earnings. America also seemed to offer greater social mobility. A farm laborer might acquire land, an artisan could establish a workshop, and a factory worker might save enough to open a small business. Not everyone achieved these ambitions, and many remained trapped in poverty. But visible examples of success kept the promise alive. Immigrant shopkeepers, landowners, contractors, and professionals became proof that advancement was possible. Their achievements were repeated in letters and conversations until exceptional stories began to sound like ordinary outcomes. Political and religious freedom added another dimension to the American image. Refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848 saw the United States as a republic where political participation and public debate were possible. Religious minorities believed they could establish churches, schools, newspapers, and community organizations with less interference from the state. Jewish families fleeing restrictions in Eastern Europe hoped to live and work without the same discriminatory laws. Although prejudice also existed in America, the country offered legal and civic possibilities unavailable to many people in Europe. The most persuasive information did not come from governments or newspapers, but from relatives who had already emigrated. Letters from America described wages, employment, housing, and the price of land. Some contained photographs or money, providing tangible evidence that the sender had survived and perhaps improved their circumstances. These messages were read aloud to relatives and neighbors, allowing one immigrant's experience to influence an entire community. A letter arriving from New York, Wisconsin, or Illinois could change the future of several families. Established immigrants often paid for the passage of those who remained behind. Prepaid tickets allowed a worker in the United States to bring over a spouse, sibling, parent, or child. This process created migration chains in which people from the same European town settled in the same American neighborhood or agricultural region. New arrivals did not enter a completely unknown world. They could be met at the port, directed toward employment, and temporarily housed by people who spoke their language. Every successful arrival made the journey appear less dangerous to the next group. Shipping companies recognized the enormous profits available from mass migration. Their agents traveled through European towns, distributing posters, pamphlets, schedules, and descriptions of life overseas. Railroads and land companies also promoted American settlement because new communities would purchase land, transport goods, and create customers along expanding routes. Some advertisements provided useful information, while others deliberately concealed the cost, difficulty, and danger of the journey. America was transformed into a product, carefully marketed to people desperate for an alternative. The Promised Land existed partly in reality and partly in imagination. America offered land, employment, and freedoms that were genuinely unavailable to many Europeans, but it also contained exploitation, discrimination, industrial danger, and severe inequality. Most emigrants understood that the journey involved risk. What mattered was that the risk appeared more hopeful than remaining where they were. By the time they reached the ports of departure, America was no longer merely a country on a map. It had become the name given to every possibility Europe seemed unable to provide. 4. Leaving everything behind and crossing the Atlantic. The journey to America began long before an immigrant stepped aboard a ship. Most families first had to decide what could be carried and what had to be abandoned. Land, animals, furniture, tools, and household objects were sold, often for less than their true value, because neighbors knew the owners were desperate to leave. Clothing, documents, religious objects, family photographs, and a small amount of food were packed into wooden trunks or cloth bundles. Every object selected represented a choice between preserving the past and surviving the journey ahead. Paying for the passage could consume the savings of an entire family. Some borrowed money, sold their last possessions, or received tickets purchased by relatives already living in the United States. When there was not enough money for everyone to travel, One family member often departed alone. A father, older son, or unmarried daughter might cross first, find employment, and send money home for the others. These separations were supposed to be temporary, but illness, unemployment, or changing immigration laws sometimes kept families apart for years. Reaching the European port was itself a difficult migration. Travelers from inland villages crossed borders by foot, wagon, riverboat, or train, often entering a major city for the first time. Liverpool received migrants from Britain and Ireland, while Hamburg and Bremen became important departure points for Central and Eastern Europeans. Naples, Genoa, Trieste, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Le Havre connected other regions of the continent to Atlantic routes. Around these ports, lodging houses, ticket offices, medical stations, money exchanges, and shipping agents formed an entire economy based on human departure. The final farewell was often the most emotionally difficult moment. Emigrants knew that letters might take weeks to arrive, and that returning to Europe would be expensive or impossible. Parents watched adult children leave with the expectation that they might never meet again. Families gathered at railway stations, village roads, and harbor docks for brief farewells before officials ordered passengers forward. What appeared in government records as the movement of labor was, at the personal level, the permanent separation of families and communities. During the early 19th century, most immigrants crossed the Atlantic aboard wooden sailing ships designed primarily to transport cargo. Ship owners converted the lower decks into temporary passenger spaces, placing large numbers of people in narrow compartments with limited ventilation and privacy. The voyage depended on winds and weather and could last 6 weeks or considerably longer. Passengers spent most of that time surrounded by strangers, unable to communicate with crew members or with migrants who spoke different languages. Conditions below deck were frequently harsh. Families slept in closely arranged bunks and stored their belongings in whatever space remained. Fresh water was limited, food was basic, and cooking facilities were often inadequate for the number of passengers. Storms forced people to remain below deck, where the air became heavy and the movement of the ship caused widespread seasickness. Sanitation was poor, creating conditions in which infectious diseases could spread quickly among already weakened travelers. Irish emigrant vessels during the Great Famine became especially notorious. Many were overcrowded, poorly supplied, and unprepared to protect passengers weakened by hunger and illness. These ships later became known as coffin ships because of their high mortality rates, although conditions varied between vessels and routes. The tragedy revealed how private companies could profit from desperate migration while accepting little responsibility for passenger safety. Public criticism and new regulations gradually forced improvements, but enforcement remained inconsistent. The introduction of large steamships transformed the Atlantic crossing during the second half of the 19th century. Steam power made schedules more predictable and gradually reduced the journey to roughly 1 or 2 weeks. Companies such as Cunard, White Star, and Hamburg America developed regular routes connecting European ports with the United States, yet the benefits were divided by class. Wealthy travelers occupied comfortable cabins, while most immigrants traveled in steerage, the cheapest section located deep within the ship. Steerage passengers lived together in large compartments divided by rows of metal bunks. Men and women were sometimes separated, while families attempted to protect children and belongings in a crowded environment. Despite the discomfort, these spaces also became temporary communities. Passengers exchanged information about American jobs, shared food, cared for children, sang familiar songs, and searched for people from their own regions. The journey brought together Irish, Germans, Italians, Jews, Poles, Scandinavians, and others who had imagined America separately, but were now approaching it on the same vessel. As the ship neared the American coast, passengers gathered on deck searching for the first signs of land. After 1886, those entering New York Harbor might see the Statue of Liberty rising above the water, although millions also arrived through Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, and other ports. Relief was mixed with fear because reaching America did not guarantee admission. The immigrants had crossed the ocean, but inspections and questioning still stood between them and their new lives. Behind them was a continent they might never see again. Ahead was a country whose promises had not yet been tested. 5. Castle Garden, Ellis Island, and the struggle to survive arrival in the United States did not immediately end the immigrants' uncertainty. Before they could search for work, reunite with relatives, or continue toward another city, they had to pass through a system designed to inspect, record, and sometimes reject them. Procedures changed throughout the 19th century as immigration moved from state control to federal authority. For exhausted passengers, however, the central fear remained the same. After selling everything and crossing the Atlantic, they could still be refused entry and sent back to Europe. In New York, Castle Garden became the country's first major immigrant processing center in 1855. Located at the southern end of Manhattan, it received millions of newcomers during the following decades, especially Irish and German immigrants. Officials registered arriving passengers and attempted to protect them from dishonest agents, money changers, and employers waiting near the docks. Castle Garden also connected immigrants with transportation, relatives, and employment opportunities, making it an early gateway between the Atlantic crossing and life in America. By the late 19th century, immigration had grown beyond the capacity of the existing system. The federal government assumed greater control, and Ellis Island opened in New York Harbor on January 1, 1892. Its first immigration station was destroyed by fire in 1897, and a larger fireproof complex opened in 1900. Over the next several decades, Ellis Island processed millions of people, becoming the most recognizable symbol of European immigration to the United States. Not every passenger experienced arrival in the same way. First- and second-class travelers were generally inspected aboard the ship and allowed to continue directly into the city. Steerage passengers were transferred to ferries and taken to Ellis Island, where they entered a large registration hall carrying children, documents, and the few possessions they had brought from Europe. They waited in lines while interpreters, physicians, inspectors, and clerks attempted to evaluate hundreds or even thousands of arrivals in a single day. The medical examination could be brief but intimidating. Doctors watched immigrants as they climbed stairs, searching for difficulties with movement, breathing, vision, or general health. Anyone suspected of having a serious condition could be marked for further inspection and separated from the main line. Some were held in the island's hospital facilities until officials decided whether they could enter. This uncertainty was especially frightening for families who feared that one medical decision might separate them permanently. Legal inspectors compared each immigrant's answers with information recorded on the ship's passenger manifest. They asked about identity, occupation, destination, available money, criminal history, and whether someone in America was waiting for them. Contrary to a popular legend, officials at Ellis Island generally did not invent new surnames. Passenger names had already been written on manifests at the European ports of departure. Changes usually occurred later because of language difficulties, clerical errors, or immigrants adapting their names to American society. Most immigrants were eventually admitted, but the possibility of rejection shaped the entire experience. Those considered likely to depend on public assistance, those with certain medical conditions, and those who violated immigration restrictions could be detained or excluded. Hearings were held for complicated cases, sometimes leaving families waiting for days or weeks. Although only a small percentage of Ellis Island arrivals were ultimately denied entry, every immigrant standing in line had reason to fear being among them. Passing inspection brought relief, but it did not bring security. Newcomers entered cities where affordable housing was scarce, and employers could take advantage of people unfamiliar with English and American laws. Many families crowded into tenement buildings with limited ventilation, shared sanitation, and little natural light. Several relatives or lodgers might occupy a small apartment so that rent could be divided. These neighborhoods offered shelter, but disease, fire, and unstable employment remained constant dangers. Immigrants accepted some of the most exhausting and hazardous jobs in the American economy. They worked in garment workshops, steel mills, slaughterhouses, mines, construction sites, domestic service, and railroad camps. Men, women, and sometimes children contributed wages because a single income was rarely sufficient. Workdays were long, accidents were common, and dismissal could come without warning. Employers often used differences of language and nationality to divide workers or replace those who demanded better conditions. Ethnic neighborhoods became essential systems of survival. Irish, German, Italian, Jewish, Polish, Scandinavian, and other communities established churches, synagogues, schools, newspapers, businesses, and mutual aid societies. Earlier arrivals helped newcomers find rooms and jobs, while community organizations provided assistance during illness or unemployment. These neighborhoods allowed immigrants to preserve familiar languages and traditions while adapting to American life. The struggle did not end at Castle Garden or Ellis Island. It continued in every factory, tenement, mine, and crowded street, where newcomers attempted to transform permission to enter into a genuine future. 6. The immigrants who built modern America and the backlash against them. European immigrants did not build the United States alone. Indigenous peoples, enslaved and free Black Americans, Asian immigrants, Mexicans, and generations of native-born workers were also essential to its development. Yet the arrival of millions of Europeans between 1820 and 1924 supplied much of the labor demanded by a rapidly expanding industrial economy. Their work connected distant regions, enlarged cities, and transformed the United States from a predominantly agricultural nation into one of the world's leading industrial powers. Irish laborers became especially important in canals, docks, railroads, construction projects, mines, and urban services. After fleeing famine and poverty, many accepted work that was physically exhausting and poorly paid because few alternatives were available. Irish communities also became influential in municipal politics, particularly in cities such as New York and Boston. Through churches, neighborhood organizations, unions, and political associations, a population once treated as permanently foreign gradually acquired a powerful public voice. German immigrants brought a wide range of agricultural, industrial, commercial, and professional experience. Many established farms across the Midwest, while others worked as artisans, brewers, merchants, teachers, journalists, and manufacturers in expanding cities. German-language newspapers, schools, cultural associations, and musical societies became important institutions in American life. Political refugees who arrived after the revolutions of 1848 also contributed to debates over democracy, labor rights, education, and the abolition of slavery. Scandinavian immigrants settled heavily in states such as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. Many used their agricultural knowledge to establish farms in regions promoted by railroad companies and land agents. They organized cooperatives, churches, schools, and local newspapers that helped isolated settlements survive. Their communities demonstrated how immigration transformed not only the great industrial cities, but also the rural landscape of the northern and western United States. Italian immigrants supplied labor to railroads, mines, factories, construction projects, farms, and municipal infrastructure. Many initially planned to work temporarily, save money, and return to Italy. producing a constant movement between the two countries. Those who remained established businesses, mutual aid societies, churches, newspapers, and densely connected neighborhoods. Their labor helped reshape cities, while their food, music, religious festivals, and family traditions became recognizable parts of American culture. Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe played a major role in the garment industry, retail trade, publishing, education, entertainment, medicine, and urban commerce. In crowded districts such as New York's Lower East Side, they built synagogues, schools, theaters, newspapers, and assistance organizations. Jewish workers were also active in labor movements that demanded safer workplaces, shorter hours, and better wages. Their communities combined the preservation of cultural identity with intense participation in American civic and economic life. Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Lithuanian, and other immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe became essential workers in steel mills, coal mines, slaughterhouses, factories, and railroad centers. Entire neighborhoods developed near industrial workplaces, allowing families to maintain familiar languages and customs. These communities created churches, clubs, credit associations, and mutual aid societies that provided support unavailable from employers or government institutions. They're labor-powered industries that produce the steel, fuel, machinery, and transportation systems of modern America. Immigrant workers also helped transform the relationship between labor and capital. They organized strikes, joined unions, published newspapers, and demanded protections against long hours, low wages, and unsafe conditions. Differences of language, religion, and nationality sometimes divided them, and employers frequently exploited those divisions. But shared working conditions gradually encouraged cooperation across ethnic boundaries. Many workplace protections later considered fundamental emerged from struggles in which immigrant laborers played a central role. Their growing influence provoked a powerful backlash. Nativist movements claimed that Catholic, Jewish, Southern European, and Eastern European immigrants could not become loyal Americans. Irish people were portrayed as politically corrupt, Italians as dangerous, Jews as unwilling to assimilate, and Slavic immigrants as intellectually inferior. These accusations were supported by false racial theories and by fears that newcomers would lower wages, change American culture, or challenge the power of established Protestant elites. During periods of war and economic crisis, suspicion became even more intense. Congress gradually transformed this prejudice into national policy. A literacy test was imposed in 1917, followed by the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which limited immigration according to nationality. The Immigration Act of 1924 created even stricter quotas based on earlier census figures, favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while sharply restricting those from Southern and Eastern Europe. The law marked the end of the great era of European mass migration. By then, however, the people the country attempted to exclude had already transformed its cities, industries, politics, labor movements, and culture. America had been rebuilt by immigrants and then tried to close the door behind them.